Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be discussing They Called Me a Lioness, A Palestinian Girl's Fight for Freedom by Ahed Tamimi. That's her on the cover. And Dena Takruri. Now, Dena is a journalist who I think probably interviewed Ahed and helped her put this story together. So it is her story, but you could say framed by a journalist. And by far, if we think about the books that I've been reading for this project of understanding the Israel-Palestine issue better, what I think this book provides as an invaluable contribution is what is it like for a female Palestinian minor to be put into an Israeli jail. Now, keep in mind, it's strangely enough nothing like what the men are used to. The men go through terrible, terrible things, and some of that has been talked about in Amira Haas's Drinking the Sea at Gaza. I'll put a card to that video. But it doesn't matter that it's not as brutal as what the men are facing. It's still pretty brutal. And this is a firsthand, very current account. So she experienced this in the last 10 years. So her story, I think, is really, really relevant. Now, you have to keep in mind that part of the way that the book is structured is to get people to understand the issue who've probably never heard about this. I wasn't following... I've never been a big follower of the news, you could say, but I didn't know about the entire story with this girl. Apparently, there had been international news because she'd slapped an IDF soldier who was harassing her and her family in their own backyard. And somehow this was caught on social media. The IDF were embarrassed about this and then made sure they were going to set an example with her. So her story went out, became a very popular viral video. As I say, I'm learning about that now. I didn't experience it myself. And because that gave an opportunity for people to learn about the Palestinian cause, she had to do a lot of table setting, you could say, in the early on. And she does that, frankly, just by telling her own story of her own childhood. She doesn't have to go into a historical discourse about this is what happened in 1948 and this is what happened in 1967. She's talking about what's happening now in 2010, in 2014, in 2020, etc. So that's the real value of this text. It's very contemporary. So let me start with her childhood. Growing up under a foreign military occupation means living under the constant threat of state-sanctioned violence. It also means living with a total absence of freedom, which is the case for more than 5 million Palestinians in the occupied territories today. We're not citizens of Israel, nor do we have a say or any political rights in the state that controls every aspect of our lives. We're stuck with the inability to plan for our futures, to travel freely, or even to move about our territories from city to city without having to cross military checkpoints. We need permission to build our homes, to travel, to work. All the basic rights and freedoms you might take for granted living in a civil society simply don't exist when you're living under military occupation. It's not an easy life, and yet it's the only one I've ever known. On another summer night, I was fast asleep alone in my room when I heard a noise nearby. I turned on my bedside lamp only to see a rifle aimed a few inches away from my face as I lay in bed. A soldier had poked it through my bedroom window, which I had kept open to try to circulate some air in the sweltering summer heat. I stared at him blankly, too paralyzed even to scream. As soon as he pulled his rifle back, I ran to my parents' bedroom to tell them what I'd seen, but by the time I got there, the soldier was already banging on our front door. Now, keep in mind, the Tamimis, and in particular the town in which they live, they're activists. And it's hard to say. There are some Palestinians who are more participatory in resistance than others. I don't want to give the impression that all Palestinians go on marches and do the sort of resistance that the Tamimis and her family and their, let's say, greater extended family engage in. So this is why they're getting harassed. This is why they're getting night raids. But at the time, I think she was maybe 12 or 13 years old. Could you imagine being asleep in your bed and then watching a rifle aimed a few inches away from your face, just as you're trying to sleep as a child? And this is normal. The night raids, harassed, go through their stuff, steal their stuff. They don't make any inventory of anything that they take. When speaking of the villages and cities stolen from us in 1948, most Palestinians will hardly ever refer to them as Israel. Instead, they use Ad Dakil, which means inside, the 1948 lands, or more simply, 1948, or even just 48. It's an affirmation of our continued claim to the land and a constant reminder of the tremendous losses we suffered just decades ago, a still fresh wound. The endless limitations Israel imposes on us are not just about controlling the present, but about robbing us of dreaming and planning our futures. Confined to the segmented and constantly threatened patch of Palestinian land where we were born, we're denied the right to choose where to live, work, or study. And I think I've shared this in a previous review. The idea is it's not enough to just steal the present. The past has to be stolen too. So, for example, if you were born in Nablus or Jenin, wherever else, and you have an identification card for Israel, it's going to say place of birth Israel, because those towns are inside what is now the state of Israel. If you were born, let's say, somewhere in the West Bank, let's say Bethlehem, for example, your ID card will still say that, but Israel is trying to erase the memory of the Palestinians who were born outside of what are now the occupied territories. So they're even trying to steal their history. Israel didn't exist in 1942 or whenever this person was born, or 1937, whenever that person was born, but they're trying to claim that and also to crush even the memory of the past. And so the war is ongoing and across every level. And you have to realize it's not just a war on the present, it's a war on the past as well. And of course, a war on the future. I grew up dreaming about what a normal childhood might be like, of how it would feel to be free. I imagined being able to move from city to city without being stopped at checkpoints. I imagined playing outside, maybe even on a real playground or on an actual soccer field with grass, without armed soldiers interrupting my game. Instead, I played in streets and on hills and in front and backyards littered with the remnants of bullets and explosives fired at us by Israeli forces, much of this ordnance marked "Made in the United States." It's impossible to play without accidentally kicking or stepping on these artifacts. But rather than feeling like defeated victims, we began collecting and repurposing these relics of war. We'd plant flowers in empty tear gas canisters. I've transformed bullets fired at us into necklace pendants, some of which I've gifted to close friends. The fence in front of Jana and my uncle Bilal's home is decorated with dozens of empty tear gas canisters, an unusual display that sends a message to the Israeli army that despite its attempts to literally choke and suppress us, we're still standing. We strive to create life out of death and will continue to find beauty even in the ugliest parts of our lives. Now, this part of her story really surprised me, but after the surprise, I contextualized it and thought children really are able to make the most of whatever circumstances they find themselves in. I'll put a link to a book I've reviewed quite early on, Portraits of the Occupation, about the photos that can be taken of the occupation. And you'll see children using, let's say, a demolished roof as a bit of a slide. Right? There's great sadness. I mean, what are the stories behind that demolished home? And yet they're still going to be children. So come to find out that as a child, Ahed and her friends, and she wasn't isolated, this wasn't only her family game, they would play a game called Army and Arabs. Now, for those of you who are Americans, you may have heard of a game called Cowboys and Indians, and it was a classic, cowboy shooting, Indian shooting, etc. It was we'll call it a parody. It related back to that time in the Old West, and oversimplification, maybe not. And so apparently there's a version of this game inside Palestine. As a child, I loved nothing more than to play outside in the street or on the many hills in our village. On the weekends, I'd sometimes go out to play as early as 7 a.m. and stay out till midnight, along with all the boys and girls in Nabi Sala. That's the name of her village. As with other Palestinian children, our favorite game was Jaish o Arab, or Army and Arabs, which is basically the Palestinian version of Cowboys and Indians. We divide ourselves into two groups. One group was the Israeli army, and the other group was the Palestinians. Within the Palestinian group, we assigned ourselves the roles of medics, journalists, and of course protesters. Those playing the role of Israeli army soldiers carried long pieces of wood shaped like rifles, or if they were lucky enough to own them, toy guns. I just want to pause for a moment. This is a way for children to deal with what is clearly a traumatic occupation, a brutal, terrible occupation, and they've managed to turn it into a game where they can derive a little bit of joy, even though they may not understand as children the implications of what's going on. I think there's a story, there's a lesson here. As soon as the game officially began, the two sides would clash, mimicking the scenes we'd seen on the news and eventually on Fridays during our village's resistance marches. So there was a settlement built near Navi Saleh, and they basically over time took over the village spring. And there would be a peaceful march towards the spring, and as usual, the settlers can't stand peaceful marches, and they would call in the soldiers, and there would be tear gas and rubber bullets and all the rest of it. The Palestinians in the game threw small rocks at the army, who responded by shooting them with their toy guns. Sometimes the kids playing the soldiers threw rocks back at their rivals to ensure they fell. Usually, though, they just chased the Palestinian until they got them to fall to the ground. The Palestinian would, of course, fight back with all their might, but the soldier would beat them either until they were arrested, old shoelaces made excellent makeshift handcuffs, or until they gave up and cried out, "I've been shot." I usually played a medic along with the other girls. When I'd hear a kid cry out that they'd been shot, I'd run over to my wounded compatriot to treat their injuries and eventually take them away in a make-believe ambulance. But when I wasn't tending to the wounded, I also partook in the resistance by throwing stones myself. Meanwhile, the soldiers proceeded to chase down and arrest whomever they could. The children who were playing journalists pretended to document it all, occasionally grabbing one of the Palestinian protesters for an interview. It was great fun. And I know I'm smiling here as I read this in a way because I can't believe that children can process such horrible things that have been done to them and to their community in this way. And yet I can't deny there's a certain charm about how the kids have not just given in to despair, but have somewhat played a game with this, having medics, having journalists. The rules of the game stipulated that anyone who was arrested was disqualified and that anyone who was killed and became a martyr got to come back to life and play another role. Sometimes, though, we'd bend the rules and pretend that one of the kids who was arrested had served a year-long prison sentence and was getting released. We'd take a break from the fighting to give him a hero's welcome, complete with celebratory singing and chanting. We played Jaish o Arab any chance we could, sometimes starting in the morning and wrapping up past our bedtimes, long after the sun had set and our parents had tired of calling us to come home. More often than not, we were so dedicated to our roles and committed to our battle that we truly roughed each other up. We played with such passion and conviction that we felt we were actually freeing Palestine. In hindsight, I recognize that this wasn't the healthiest game to play. The trauma we regularly endured under occupation was so inescapable that it even manifested in our time meant for fun. Perhaps it was our way of coping. Yes, perhaps. And I'm really grateful for her sharing her story there with us so that we can understand, get a tiny bit of insight into the lives of these children under occupation. So one of the things that really strikes me about the Palestinian resistance is oftentimes it's symbolic. So I have actually held a Qassam rocket in my hand. It's maybe altogether about this size, and it had broken in half. And I was at a settler's home in Stro, and part of their house had been hit by this rocket. There was some damage, but they had gotten a notification. They'd gone to their safe room, etc. And if you look at these Qassam rockets, they are fireworks, effectively. They are protests, but they are not serious weapons that really kill Israelis in the way that Israeli weapons indiscriminately kill Palestinians. There's no comparison between the two. And so in the same way, Palestinians throw rocks as a sign of resistance. But if you think about a rock, throwing that against an armored personnel carrier or against a fully armed IDF soldier, a rock, especially with their helmets and sometimes face shields, it's nothing. It's just going to bounce off, especially off a tank or an armored APC. It's symbolic. And what it's showing is we resist you. We do not accept this occupation. And not only is that, I would say, perfectly legitimate under international law to resist an occupation, I would say there's almost a duty to resist an occupation. And so the Palestinians are simply doing this. But what we know always happens is when Palestinians throw rocks, especially children, the IDF shoots them in the head. The other point to consider is the armed and violent nature of the Israeli soldier who is intruding upon our land. Given the bulletproof uniform he's wearing and the armored vehicle he's riding in, a stone is highly unlikely to cause him any serious bodily harm. A stone for us is a symbol. It represents our rejection of the enemy who has come to attack us. To practice nonviolence doesn't mean we'll lie down and surrender to our fate submissively. We still have an active role to play in defending our land. Stones help us act as if we're not victims, but freedom fighters. This mindset helps motivate us in the fight to reclaim our rights, dignity, and land. So in a certain sense, you could say throwing stones are nonviolent in the sense that they don't really inflict harm, but they are showing in a way that doesn't really inflict violence on the other party. I mean, does a rock inflict violence on a tank? That they are resisting, and I applaud that. I understood the asymmetry of it all, and this is when she's talking about the effect of the marches over time. I understood the asymmetry of it all, despite the fact that our flags, chants, and stones were no match for their rubber-coated steel bullets, tear gas, and sound grenades. The Israeli forces had no moral qualms about unleashing brute violence upon us. And I can't get into it now, but she recounts a number of family members and friends who are maimed and killed in these peaceful marches. And one of the techniques that they've started to use now, part of crowd control, part of what the Palestinians export and sell around the world, is skunk water. Skunk water was invented by an Israeli company called Ordotech, which hails itself as a green company and calls its product 100% safe for people, animals, and plants, in addition to being the most effective, cost-efficient, and safest riot control solution available. The Israeli military has praised skunk water's efficacy as a non-lethal riot dispersal method, and the Israeli police have called it a humane option. But there's nothing humane about how the military deliberately targets our homes with the skunk truck, shattering windows and punishing even those who seek refuge indoors, nor how it can injure anyone in its path. One time, my mother was participating in a march when the skunk truck accelerated in her direction and began spraying skunk water right at her. She lowered herself to the ground and sat on her knees with her back turned to the truck. The water sprayed her from behind with such great force it propelled her forward onto the cement. When she came home, her knees and shins were cut up and bloody, and she reeked. Even after showering, the odor was so offensive that my dad joked that he was on the brink of divorcing her. So a little bit of humor there, obviously, but this is one of the crowd control techniques. And as I say, I couldn't talk about all the different stories that Ahed tells about her family and what's been going on, but I thought I would pick one story about her cousin, Mustafa, and give you a bit of a sense of what happened with him. So once again, we see disproportional force being used. And I think what happened was Mustafa was either throwing rocks or running behind an Israeli vehicle. And here, I'll just read from it. What started out as an ordinary march that day, though, ended in a tragedy that none of us was prepared to handle. Mustafa Tamimi, my distant cousin, who was 28 at the time, was shot in the face with a tear gas canister by a soldier who was no more than 10 feet away from him. I was standing farther back on the same street when it happened. I had begun retreating to avoid inhaling tear gas when I heard people shouting that someone had gotten shot and to call an ambulance. From a distance, I could see Mustafa lying on his back in the middle of the street in his crisp white shirt and jeans, his face completely covered in blood. A friend of his rushed over to him to try to stop the flow by pressing a checkered black and white keffiyeh scarf, a symbol of Palestinian identity and resistance, to his face. As Mustafa was taken to the hospital, the eyewitnesses to his murder, corroborated by photographs from the journalists who captured the moment, revealed what exactly had happened. Mustafa and his friend had been following a couple of armored jeeps, demanding that they leave the village. He was poised to hurl a rock at the jeep right in front of him when a soldier inside it opened its rear door, aimed his high-force, long-range tear gas canister directly at Mustafa, and shot him point-blank in the face. The soldier then closed the door, and the jeep drove off as Mustafa fell to the ground. The Israeli army's own regulations forbid soldiers from firing tear gas directly at people. It must be fired from a distance of roughly 100 feet and pointed upward, so that the canister lands at the feet of demonstrators. Such rules never stopped the army from aiming directly at people, though, as many demonstrators in Nabi Saleh got hit in the legs. But the head? This was an egregious first. And I'm sure you can guess, unfortunately, Mustafa died. We eventually learned that no one would be held accountable for Mustafa's death. An investigation by the Israeli military advocate general determined that the soldier who had fatally shot Mustafa did not break any rules. Despite photographic evidence and eyewitness accounts proving the opposite, the MAG believed the soldier's bogus claims that he hadn't seen Mustafa when he fired the tear gas canister directly at him from close range. A recurring theme, if you watched any of my videos, the IDF never gets punished for any of its wrongdoings, because that's what it means to be the most moral army in the world, is having zero accountability. So here are two more instances that Ahed shares. These are not from her village, but giving, I think, readers who might not be familiar, general context of the sort of outrages that are visited on Palestinian civilians. It happened in the middle of the night when the young family of four was fast asleep in the West Bank village of Duma. This is the Dawabshe family. Two Israeli settlers threw a firebomb into their house, setting it ablaze. Flames engulfed the home, and baby Ali, just 18 months old, was killed. His father, Saad, was so badly burned that he died a week later. That left the mother, Reham Dawabseh, and her 4-year-old son, Ahmed, as the only surviving members of the family. Reham, who was a teacher in an elementary school, suffered third-degree burns on 90% of her body, and after nearly 5 weeks on life support, she also died. And so 4-year-old Ahmed became the sole surviving member of his immediate household. Second and third-degree burns covered 60% of his body, and this little boy was now motherless, fatherless, and brotherless. The Dawabshes were not the first. Just 1 year earlier, we were shaken by a horror story of a settler attack against a 16-year-old Palestinian boy named Mohammed Abu Qadir. Now, you may have heard this story because it's particularly horrific. Mohammed was walking to a mosque near his home in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Shufat one night during Ramadan when he was suddenly grabbed and forced into a car. The 3 Israeli settlers who abducted him drove him to a forest in Jerusalem, where they beat him with a crowbar. They then forced him to drink gasoline, poured the remaining gasoline over him, and lit him on fire. When his mutilated body was found dumped in the forest hours later, it was burned beyond recognition. An autopsy later discovered soot in the lungs, suggesting that Mohammed was still alive and breathing when he was set on fire. He suffered beyond belief. It was later reported that his attackers were seeking revenge for the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli settler teens whose bodies had been found the day before. Still, nothing could justify the grisly torture and murder of Mohammed Abu Qadir, who looked even smaller and younger than his age. Something else I appreciated about Ahed is she understands the humanity in some of the Jews who had volunteered to help and stand by and advocate on these marches. And she talks about one of them named Jonathan, who was close to their family, almost, let's say, becoming like family. They would sleep at their house and eat with them. Getting to know Jonathan and the other Israeli activists gave me tremendous hope, perhaps for the first time in my life. I began to think that if they could stand in solidarity with Palestinians and criticize their own state for the injustices inflicted upon us, perhaps in time other Israelis would as well. Through them, I learned that our problem was not with the Jewish people, but rather with Zionism. It's not a religious problem, but a political one. So I have to say, if Ahed, who has lived under this occupation, has hope, in a sense, it's incumbent upon the rest of us to have some hope as well. I see that occupation in the 13-year-old armed settler who carries a rifle slung over his shoulder everywhere he goes. I see it in the 20-year-old Israeli soldier who aims his weapon right at us and shoots, undeterred by the presence of children or by basic morality. But our Israeli activist friends showed me that there are good people on the other side, people with whom we can build together. They showed me there is hope. Now, I told you there was the slap, right? In fact, there's a chapter called The Slap in here, and it's, you could say, what shot ahead to international popularity later on. She had before gotten a lot of attention, even as a young, I think 11, 12-year-old activist, but this was the event that, let's say, catapulted her and put her in jail. And she recalls her father's own interrogation as a way to help her when she went through her interrogation. I thought specifically of my father's story of the interrogation that nearly killed him in 1993, years before I was born, when Israel falsely accused him of killing an Israeli settler. That interrogation was so brutal, and my father's injuries so severe, that Human Rights Watch documented what occurred. I'd heard my father retell the story many times throughout my childhood. He recalled being hooded before being taken into the interrogation room. The interrogator tied his hands to the back of his chair and left him to sit in that agonizing position all night. The next morning, the interrogator proceeded to beat him while questioning him. He repeatedly grabbed my father's chin and flipped his head back and forth with great force. He also shook Baba's head left and right and twisted his neck around. My father said all the shaking and jolting was so painful that it felt as if his brain were rolling around loose in his head. He was ultimately shaken and beaten so badly that he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and fell into a coma for 10 days. He woke up temporarily paralyzed with 36 stitches in his head, and he was never charged. What helped me withstand my interrogation and the ones that followed was disassociating from my body in the interrogation room. So she's talking about now leaning on her father's story and then going through her own ordeal. Was disassociating from my body in the interrogation room, switching myself to autopilot. My body might be physically in the same room as my interrogator, but my mind would drift off to a faraway space inhabited only by me. Once I was there, I no longer had to see what was in front of me. Sure, I might have been looking right at my interrogator, but I wasn't actually seeing him. I was in a totally different world, one that my mind had created as an escape, and I made sure it was a world I loved. And in that world, as a survival strategy, my imagination would kick into overdrive. And you won't believe this, maybe you will. Do you know the Palestinians have to pay for their own prison? At this point, this is at 5. At this point, whoever wanted to eat breakfast, this is around 10:30 a.m. This is during a typical jail day. At this point, whoever wanted to eat breakfast headed to the communal kitchen where all 32 women in the cell block shared, I learned that the responsibility for meal preparation fell squarely on the prisoners, so they have to cook their own food. In fact, the cost of most of the food also fell on the prisoners. The prison administration provided the bare minimum, some chicken once a week, rice, some vegetables, and a box of fruit, either oranges or apples, which they distribute so that each of us got precisely 1 orange or 1 apple a week. None of the food they provided was ever enough, so we'd have to supplement it by purchasing more from the canteen with money our families deposited into our accounts. Can you imagine having to pay for your own jail? There's administrative detention. Remember that this is a technique, you can't really call it a law, it's sort of lawless law, in which people are allowed to just be detained without charge indefinitely. I knew all about administrative detention from all the times that it happened to my father, and now she's talking about a fellow inmate, Khalida. It meant that neither Khalida nor her lawyer knew the reason for her arrest and imprisonment, nor when she'd get out. As was always the case with administrative detention, all they knew was that Israel had a secret file on her that classified her as a security threat. Any evidence they allegedly had was never disclosed to her, and so her detention was indefinite. She was initially ordered to serve 6 months in prison under administrative detention. At the end of that 6th month, they extended it by another 6 months and then another 4. Having seen my father serve so much time in administrative detention, I intimately understood the agony that comes with such an uncertain sentence. You don't know why you're charged. You don't know how long you're going to be staying there for. There's also the tactics used during this whole, kangaroo process. On another occasion, I was transported to a court hearing that seemingly everyone but me and the prison system database knew had been postponed. I had heard of this happening to other prisoners. A court date would be scheduled, and the prosecutor would say they were unable to make it, so the hearing would be postponed for a week, but the prisoner's name would remain in the system, and they'd be taken to the court regardless. They're transported in this horrible metal vehicle that's very loud. There's a chain that's clanging. They sit in a very cold room prior to coming in. All of these things you have to realize are part of the techniques of the Israelis trying to wear down the Palestinians so that they'll confess to some conspiracy or name names or just give up, right? That's what they want to do. They want to break these people. and all of these techniques, they fit together. Remember that Israel had to respond to this 16, 17-year-old girl slapping an Israeli soldier. And Israeli lawmaker Oren Hazan of the right-wing Likud party argued that a slap is terrorism, adding, if I was there, she would finish in the hospital. Oh, what a brave man beating up a 16-year-old girl. For sure, no one could stop me. I would kick her face, believe me. This is a member of parliament. Israel's then education minister, and at the time of this writing, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, who had a short period between Netanyahu periods, said that Noor, I think this was one of her relatives, and I deserve to finish our lives in prison. A 17-year-old girl for slapping an Israeli soldier. Shortly after I was arrested, a prominent Israeli journalist named Ben Caspit wrote, "We should exact the price at some other opportunity in the dark without witnesses and cameras." Can you imagine? These people are so brave and strong, beating up a young girl without cameras. Dealing with Tamimi and her family has to be severe, exhaust all legal measures, and generate deterrence. This is what one of the defense ministers said in justifying the arrests. Once you've read and gotten to know Ahed in this text, you will know what she was going to say, and this is how I'm going to end the review. It's not quite a parole hearing, but it's in your final months of your term. And if you basically make a statement of contrition, they might let you off early. And if you've been reading the book, it's towards the end of the book, and you know, okay, I know what Ahed is going to say here. Don't even dream that I'm going to apologize to you or to this court. And even if you forced me to attend 10 trials like this, don't think I'll ever apologize to you. Because if I apologize to you now, I'd be apologizing to the soldier that killed my cousin an hour ago. I refuse to apologize. And if you think I'm going to say I'll never repeat what I did, you're mistaken. As long as you're occupying our land, I'll do what I did again. And I won't just slap one soldier, I'll slap 10 soldiers every time they come to the front of our house. I'll even slap you if I have to, even if I have to live in prison. Before I could finish, the guards ejected me from the court. I was immediately notified that I would not be granted early release, which came as no shock. So, yeah, I'd slap 10 soldiers if you need to. So, they called me a lioness. Ahed Tamimi and Dena Takruri recommended. If you'd like to support this channel, hit like, hit subscribe, share this with people who are interested in hearing stories from the Palestinians themselves about the occupation. You can buy a copy of the book using one of the links below. That's one of the ways you can support this channel. Another way you can support the channel, of course, is to become a member of my Patreon or my YouTube members. You'll get early releases of videos like this one and have a chance to talk to me about the choices I made in putting together the review itself, or even the choices of the books. Choices of books, speaking of which, there's also my Amazon wish list, which offers a number of books that I'm interested in that you could pick for me to review in the future. We're probably talking about 2025 at this point, but always welcome that. It's another way to support the channel. And in 2024, as a reminder, a portion of the proceeds of any of these different ways that you can support the channel are going to go to the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. There's a link to that in the description below. I urge you to support them directly yourself. They provide medical care to Palestinian children who would not otherwise be able to receive it. But you can also support them indirectly by supporting my work here. Until next time, enjoy your reading.